Support for Kojo's 20th anniversary comes from Chase, driving inclusive growth in Greater Washington by supporting career opportunities, entrepreneurship, and affordable housing.
Water covers more than 2/3 of the Earth's surface, but the rule of law doesn't exactly extend to a good deal of those open spaces. According to a recent New York Times investigation, roughly 40% of the world's surface is covered by water outside of any nation's jurisdiction or control. 80 million square miles that are essentially free of regulation, where lawlessness is commonplace. Reporter Ian Urbina recently documented how crimes running the gamut from slavery to illegal fishing to murder can take place in international waters, often going unpunished, and how products many of us consume in markets like this one in the Washington region come through corners of the globe where outlaws can commit crimes with impunity. Ian Urbina is an investigative reporter for the New York Times. He joins us in studio. Ian, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us by phone is Maria Boyle, the Traceability Director for Fishwise, a nonprofit sustainable seafood consultancy. Maria Boyle, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Ian, in your reporting, you describe places where modern-day slavery exists on ships, where engineers can launch rockets from the middle of the water to escape oversight, where ships regularly dump engine oil and sludge into oceans. I was going to ask what makes this possible, but allow me to delay that for a second and said, what sent you off on this investigative mission?
So many years ago, about a decade ago, I was in grad school and I took some time off and worked on a ship. It was harbored in Singapore, and I had always a vague fascination with the high seas, and after that short 3-month stint on this ship, it only grew, and so I always wanted to find a way to get back out there and tell the stories of the people that work out there.
Well, for those of us who read this series of reports, it was a fascinating series of reports, but back to my original question, what makes all of this crime possible?
So at root, what makes it possible is a couple things. One, the high seas are a distinct place. It's about 42% of the Earth's surface, and these are the waters that lie outside of national jurisdiction, so they belong to no one and everyone. And as such, no government really has authority to enforce law. There is a lot of law on the books relating to the high seas.
There are maritime pacts that exist between countries, but what kind of oversight and accountability do they provide?
Not a whole lot, in that when crimes do occur on the high seas, enforcement, laws are only as good as their enforcement. Enforcement is tough because and this is less true with the large container ships, which bounce between very large ports. That sector of the industry tends to be better regulated because they're interfacing with big ports where inspections are more rigorous and countries have the wherewithal to patrol. But the vast majority of the boats on the water on the high seas are not those huge container ships, and the vast number of seafarers on the high seas are not on those container ships. And those ships are, oftentimes comprised of, 7, 8 different nationalities, and the boat itself is flagged to one country, the captain is from another, the company that owns it is a third, and the crime committed against one of the crew members might be a fourth, and they're traveling through waters that belongs to none of them. So finding anyone that's willing to investigate and prosecute tends to be tough.
A lot of people would be saying, well, what does this have to do with me? But how would you describe the places these ships occupy in the global economy?
So there are almost 2 different realms. There are the big ships, shall we say, and those are going to be the container ships and big companies like Maersk. And 90% of the products we consume, from microwaves to tennis shoes, come by way of these container ships. So it's a huge role. And then among the big ships are also, the big cargo ships that transport fuel and grain and bulk. And then as a whole separate realm, there are the smaller ships, and that includes the fishing realm. So there's a multi-trillion-dollar seafood industry, and those ships, as well as smaller cargo ships, are in a second tier. And so we as consumers depend on both realms of ships in lots of different ways.
In the first installment of your series, you made a close study of a ship called the Dona Liberta, a refrigerator vessel that carried stowaways and dumped oil in open water, one you described as a case study of misconduct at sea. What is this ship's story?
So this was an attractive ship for our purposes because it illustrated 3 different categories of crimes. And it also told a larger story about, as you said before, sort of impunity on the high seas. And the Donna Liberta is in many ways a typical ship. It's in the smaller realm. It was owned by a Greek company. It flagged variously to Liberia and several other countries, Bahamas, Kiribati. And its job was to carry mostly tuna from fishing boats back to shore so that the fishing boats could continue fishing. And the Donna Liberta had very well documented crimes over the course of many years. The 3 categories that we focused on were, number 1, the Donna Liberta had been spotted by satellite technology intentionally dumping oil through what's called a magic pipe, which essentially is just a pipe or a hose that sort of discreetly channels your waste into the water under the boat. No one can see it. And they had caused a 90-mile slick off the coast of Africa. And that spoke to a much larger problem, which is the extent of intentional dumping, which is quite significant. Every 3 years, ships intentionally dump more sludge and oil than BP and Valdez spills combined. The second category was human rights, and this involved 2 Tanzanian stowaways who had snuck on board the Donna Liberta when it was in Cape Town, South Africa. They'd hid out on the ship, excuse me, and they had been discovered when the ship was at sea, and the crew of the Donna Liberta weren't sure what to do with them, were concerned about the fines they might get hit with if they showed up with these stowaways on board. And they put them on a raft, a makeshift raft in the middle of the ocean, cut them loose as a storm approached, and one of the stowaways died and the other lived. And the third category is a less dramatic but very severe and widespread problem in the seafaring world. It involves abuse of crew, and specifically, these companies, these smaller ships that run into problems, financial or otherwise. The ship gets stuck somewhere and they essentially abandon the crew. And these are mostly crew from poorer countries, and they're really stuck in many ways, in that they don't have the money nor the papers to get off the ship and try to get home, nor do they have any means on the ship to return. So some of them stay on the ship, and in the Donna Liberta's case, there were 2 Romanians that we focused on who stayed on for quite some time without food or water or electricity. It got pretty dire.
In the cases of wrongdoing that occurred on the Donna Liberta, who, in theory, was empowered to pursue that wrongdoing, or were these matters where no one had enough at stake to be willing to do something about it?
So both, really. In theory, the way the system is supposed to work is that the ship flies a flag, and the flag comes from a country, and the country runs a flag registry program. And that's a for-profit company that grants ships the right to fly their flag. And when a ship flies a flag, it's supposed to obey the laws of that country. And so there's a general push by many companies to fly the flags of the companies that have the least rules, because they're cheaper and there's less regulation that they have to deal with. But when things go wrong on a ship, and if a complaint is filed, as was the case with the stowaways, the Liberians filed a complaint about the abuse of the stowaways, it goes to the flag country, and the flag program is supposed to investigate. They rarely do. They don't have the resources. They don't have the financial incentive. And so usually they just end up there. So that's one of the biggest reasons they're not pursued.
Ian Urbina is an investigative reporter for the New York Times. He joins us in studio. Maria Boyle is the traceability director for Fishwise. It's a non-profit sustainable seafood consultancy. Maria, your name is spelled M-A-R-I-A-H. Should I say Maria or Mariah?
It's Mariah.
Ah, thank you. Mariah.
No problem.
Mariah, so much of what these ships are carrying includes products that satisfy the growing global demand for seafood. When you go to the fish market or to a grocery store, how much can you know about what it took for that product to get there?
That's a great question. What I do when I'm buying seafood and what I suggest for other consumers is to start by making informed purchasing decisions by using a seafood buying guide. One of the most popular ones is the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch Guide. They have a pocket card you can put in your wallet or a smartphone application that you can use. And that will allow you to search for products that are more sustainable. So those fishers are following the rules and harvesting the fish within the set guidelines. Going beyond that, to tackle some of the issues that Ian wrote about, including illegal fishing and human rights abuses, I suggest consumers searching for seafood reach out to the companies where they typically like to go and shop and ask them what they're doing within their business practices to improve these issues within their supply chains. It's important for these companies to hear from their customers that this is a priority issue and that their customers want to know what steps the companies are taking to make improvements. So asking questions, whether it's through a customer service line or in a store when you're going to buy some seafood, about where it came from, information about its source, and what companies are doing to improve their supply chains is a great way to elevate this conversation and make sure everyone knows that it's a priority.
Mariah, how would you assess the health of the world's fishing stocks at this point, and how do the kinds of behaviors that Ian reported on affect those stocks?
It's a good question. A lot of the world's stocks are overfished or at their current limits. We're not going to get new large volumes of seafood out of the ocean. We've done a good job maximizing our catch today. And so development of products like sustainable aquaculture are incredibly important to feed that global demand for seafood. It's an incredibly healthy protein that so many, especially coastal communities, rely on. So we need to make sure that we're continuing to fish sustainably and now farm seafood sustainably. The practices that Ian reported on, namely the illegal fishing, are a real issue because if you want to manage fisheries sustainably, you have to know what you're taking out of that resource so you can do your best in working with fishery scientists to estimate how many fish are left and to decide how much you can take out of that population each year. When these illegal vessels go in and take out some portion of that, it's not reported into the system of fishery management. And so it really undermines a lot of those conservation efforts. Similarly, the human rights abuses pose a real problem to creating fair and ethical supply chains. And they're both issues we need to take quite seriously.
Here is Michelle in Washington, D.C. Michelle, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Thanks very much, Kojo. I have a comment and a question for Ian. His series on the front page of the New York Times has brought really critical attention to this important environmental issue. And as we know, the problems he described aren't new, but it's very important right now to bring attention to what's happening on a regular basis on our oceans. The timing is critical because the U.S. government is currently tackling this problem of illegal fishing. So my question is, I'd really like to know what sort of reactions or responses have been received from any of the federal agencies with regard to your series.
Ian.
That's a tough question to answer because it's still somewhat in progress. There are so everything I say could change tomorrow, but there are several folks in Congress who are thinking about holding a hearing on this and potentially connecting it to a larger piece of legislation related to anti-trafficking and the connections between human trafficking and broader migration challenges and the illegalities that exist there, and the abuses, and the human rights violations on these ships are real. And so Congress is trying to figure out how they might better encompass the maritime concerns in that. There's also some discussion emerging about from within both federal administrations, like low-level USDA, and also in Congress, about the U.S. government is the largest institutional buyer of everything under the sun. As a consumer of stuff, the U.S. government is a big player. And so if the U.S. government decides that it's no longer going to buy X, or it's going to require Y with regard to its purchasing policy, it affects the global market, and it can lead by example. And this came up in a prior investigation we did of the garment industry, and right on the heels of the thousands of people who died in Bangladesh, the U.S. government took a close look at its purchasing policies with regard to clothes. And some of those same folks are now taking a look at whether they can use that leverage to try to improve things in the maritime world.
Michelle, thank you very much for your call. And, reading your series, it reads like crime fiction, except that it happens to be crime fact. And so one would expect that there would be a response from, if not federal agencies, from the U.S. Congress. Ian Urbina is an investigative reporter for the New York Times. He joins us in studio. Mariah Boyle is the Traceability Director for Fishwise, a nonprofit sustainable seafood consultancy. We're taking a short break, but if you have questions or comments, give us a call, 800-433-8850. What role do you think the U.S. should play in establishing firmer legal guidelines and more accountability for them in international waters? 800-433-8850. You can send us a tweet at Kojo Show or email to kojo@wamu.org. I'm Kojo Nnamdi. Welcome back. We're talking about Outlaw Seas with Ian Urbina, an investigative reporter for the New York Times who has been doing a series on Outlaw Seas, and Mariah Boyle, the Traceability Director for Fishwise, which is a nonprofit sustainable seafood consultancy. Mariah, tuna alone is a multi-billion-dollar global business. What does it take to compile information on who's in the water fishing for a product like tuna and where their product eventually goes?
That's a great question, and it's one of the areas of the seafood supply chain that needs some improvement. There needs to be more transparency about what vessels are catching the seafood products, in this case tuna. If they're being transshipped at sea, it's something Ian brought up in his article. At times, vessels don't come back to port to offload their catch. Another boat will go out to sea, take the seafood off their boat so they can continue to fish. And those steps in the supply chain can be problematic because they obscure the true source, the original fishing vessel of that product. So more monitoring and enforcement will, of course, help these issues on the high seas. But things like unique vessel identifiers will also help. If each vessel has a number that has to be on the hull of the ship, stay with it for its whole life, it will allow for the identification of boats. And right now that is not the case, so vessels will sometimes change their name at sea to kind of obscure where they've been fishing and things like that. So there are some universal improvements to the way vessels are identified and tracked that will really help all seafood supply chains, but tuna being one of those.
Talk about the regional fisheries management organizations, or RFMOs.
Yes, RFMOs are multinational groups that govern high seas fishing in certain areas. So tuna, of course, is I think the largest seafood product that we're getting from these major ocean bodies. And so these RFMOs are working together to set fishing limits, to put enforcement and monitoring practices into place to ensure that these fisheries are following the rules, happening as they should be. It's, of course, quite complex if we think about the large area that is governed by these RFMOs and the large number of vessels and nations that are kind of at play in this. So it can be complex to govern these areas, but that is the
But there is something called a consolidated list of authorized vessels that, it is my understanding, is updated on a daily basis.
Yes, the RFMOs will update the vessels that are permitted to fish within their jurisdictions, which is helpful. So that can be a legal list. I think the real problem when it comes to following these issues of illegal fishing is you're following, as Ian said, the ghost ships. So the vessels that aren't found on these lists that do have histories of illegal fishing. So the goal would be to shine the light on those vessels, to be able to identify them, to follow up with those that are not following the rules.
Ian, how would you describe the Thai fishing boat you reported on for the third installment of your series?
So this is a boat that we wanted to get to because there's been some very good reporting out of the region about the problem of forced labor in Thailand and in the fishing industry in Thailand. But very little of the reporting has occurred offshore. And as Mariah rightly points out, the transshipment boats, the long-haul boats, the ones that stay at sea for really, a couple of years sometimes, are the ones that have always been the most notorious for abuse. And so our hope was to get out on some of those and see the conditions and talk to people. This was a boat that we hopscotched our way. An amazing photographer named Adam Dean and I spent 5 weeks out on the water in South China Sea, trying to get out far enough to see some of these boats and to spend some time on them. And we hopscotched our way from one boat would take us 50 miles out, another boat would take us 50 more, and so on. And the boat that we profiled was a Thai flagged vessel. It was a purse seiner boat, so it's not a trawler. It's a certain type of fishing, uses a big net. And it had about 43 Cambodian boys and men on them, all of them, or virtually all of them, indentured migrants, most of them undocumented, who'd been sort of shuttled into the country, into Thailand, and had been working on the boat for quite some time. And the conditions on the boat were horrific, quite frankly. I mean, the sanitation conditions were, it was roach and rat infested, and these men work 18, 20-hour days.
Only allowed to sleep for maybe 2 hours at a time?
Yeah, typically 2 hours was the stint between schools, essentially. So the captain would race to go grab another school, and that would give you about 2 hours of downtime.
What relationship do these kinds of boats have with the Thai government or any kind of regulatory body in Thailand?
So Thailand, in fairness, is really getting a lot of attention, partly from organizations like Mariah's and others that have really started shining a light on some of these issues, partly also from the U.S. State Department, which last year downgraded Thailand in its human trafficking report, and this year again did the same, kept them in the lowest rung. And so Thailand is getting a lot of attention. Its big labor problems are sex trafficking of women and the fishing industry for men, and these are migrant forces. The Thai government has had a long problem, and it has been complicit, if not really actively supporting some of these trafficking syndicates in subtle ways, like Thai border officials just looking the other way when truckloads of people are coming across the border, taking kickbacks, and even more egregious stories that are not rare, quite frankly, but where Thai police or Thai immigration officials help the traffickers capture escaped indentured workers who flee a boat, end up on land, and they're hunted and handed back over to the trafficker. And there are documented cases of that occurring where the local level officials are actually involved in helping that.
Where do the products fished by boats like the one you observed typically go?
So they go both from bait to plate, right? So the stuff that we eat all over the world. We looked in our story at a interesting and somewhat surprising and large submarket, which is the animal feed and pet food market. So the smaller fish that are caught and for which it's not price efficient to use them for human consumption, or they just don't taste good and there's no market for them, often end up ground into fish meal and turned into these high-protein pellets. Those pellets are in large quantities fed to three categories of consumer. One is your dog and your cat, so either chunks of fish or pellets are mixed into the dog and cat food to make it fish-based, A second is livestock feed, so that's mostly pigs and chickens, and that's a huge market. And then the third is aquaculture, so this is fish being fed to other fish. This is the shrimp that we eat. Those are mostly on on-land farms, and those shrimp to grow big need to be fed, and they're fed this fish meal.
Mariah, Ian mentioned pet food. To what degree does demand for pet food factor into what you see happening in the commercial fishing industry?
That's a good question. The topic of pet food, I think, has come up really quite recently and is an important area for us to focus our effort. As Ian said, it's the same fish meal is being used also for the livestock and aquaculture feed. So I think we've heard a little bit more about the aquaculture feed side in terms of conversations about this fish meal being used to create feed for shrimp and feeding it to farm shrimp. The U.S. receives almost half of its shrimp from Thailand. And so this not only is an issue for pet food, as Ian has traced, but also for some of the seafood that we're consuming.
Ian, what, if anything, is happening at the international level to change the status quo when it comes to how the rule of law applies to international waters?
Well, one thing that's occurring is something that's called the UN Biodiversity Agreement, and this is an effort that has long been in the making. About a decade of discussions gone into it, and it has been driven by countries through the UN, meeting at and working through the UN. And the goal is in the next 2 years for that collection of participating countries to hash out some rules for that could be imposed on the high seas. Again, international waters or the high seas are a really tough place because they don't really belong to anyone in particular. And so if countries wanted to come together and set aside a certain zone of water as protected, right now, there are no rules on the books that would guide them as to how to do that because it doesn't belong to them. So who are they to say that no one can fish there or mine there or what have you? And so the UN, this group of participating countries in the UN are trying to confront that because the urgency of what's happening on the oceans is so well recognized now. And hopefully in the next 2 years, they will have a framework for better protecting certain areas.
It's my understanding that the United States opposed a global treaty in the past. Why?
So, as I understand it, their hesitation was that there are a lot of rules on the books already, and the argument from some within the U.S. government was rather than writing yet more rules, why don't we focus on enforcing and improving the ones that are already there, because at some point you undermine the legitimacy of any rules if you just keep laying more on. And I think there was also just a sort of practical matter, again, as it's been explained to me by sources, the U.S. the administration did not want to get behind anything that they thought there was a good chance it wouldn't be supported by Congress. So they want to pick their battles smartly. And if this was not a winnable battle because of the nature of interested parties in Congress, then they didn't want to come out in support of it because it would be yet another loss. So I think those are the two main reasons that I've heard as to why they opposed it initially. And more recently, they've come around and they're supporting the UN Biodiversity Treaty because now there seems to be a real global consensus around making it happen, and so they're getting behind it.
We're just about out of time, so you won't have a chance to answer this, but because Whit Jones tweeted it, I'm going to ask it He says, ask Ian Urbina, what's the relationship between big oil and ocean lawlessness? Your two favorite topics. I'm afraid we don't have time for him to answer that question, but maybe he will in a report at a later date. Ian Urbina is an investigative reporter for the New York Times who looks like he's been spending a lot of time on the high seas. Welcome back home, Ian. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
Mariah Boyle is the Traceability Director for Fishwise, a nonprofit sustainable seafood consultancy. Mariah, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for listening. I'm Kojo Nnamdi.
The Kojo Nnamdi Show is a production of WAMU 88.5, your listener-supported NPR news station in Washington, D.C. If you appreciate this program, become a member of WAMU today. Give online at WAMU.org. And thanks.